Good morning, women of welcome, and happy Monday. My name is Sarah Casada, and I am on the welcome team and am eager to jump in this week with another kind of frequently asked questions talking about Dreamers, DACA, and the DREAM Act. Those may be terms that you have heard used interchangeably, coming in and out of the news at different waves, and you may or may not feel like you have a strong grasp of what that is about. And I want to talk about it today because we are about to see this come through the news again, and I'll explain why. First, let me talk a little bit about who are the Dreamers. The reason that they became called Dreamers. So typically when we think of Dreamers, the population that we're talking about are immigrants who were brought to the US by their parents or other legal guardian when they were minors. And they have gone to school in the US, lived in the US. For many of them, this is the country they know best, call home. Some may or may not speak a language other than English. Some may have arrived as early as 3 years old, 6 months, all of those things, and have lived their whole life in the US, but they are without status. And so there has been a lot of movement and talk about this population over the last, almost 2 decades, because there has been this question of what do we do with kids who are in this situation? And one thing that became clear to me, even as I was preparing for this conversation, they're no longer kids. And so I am actually 1 month shy of being the oldest person who can qualify for the DREAM Act were I in that situation. So I want to help that understand, because a lot of times I know even when I think about things like the DREAM Act, I'm thinking of teenagers. And many of them were teenagers when this conversation started in 2001. So in 2001, there was a bipartisan legislation put before Congress called the DREAM Act. DREAM stands for Development, Relief, and Education of Alien Minors. And the purpose of this legislation was to create a pathway for legal permanent residence for young immigrants who had been brought to the States by their parents. So again, if I'm the oldest who qualifies for this, in 2001, I was 2 years out of high school. And so this was a population that was right around college age. Many couldn't go to college and they couldn't get a job because they didn't have legal status. And so the DREAM Act was a legislation put forth to address that and to create a pathway for those individuals. It did not pass, even with strong bipartisan support, and variations of this act have been put forth every couple years since 2001. I mean, that was a long time ago, a very long time ago if you are a person living without status, hoping and praying and seeking a way to get right with the law. And so that the most recent one was introduced in 2017. So we've done variations on this legislation over time. It typically has bipartisan, it always has bipartisan support, and it typically has very strong public support as well. And yet it has never passed in all its different forms. However, because of it being called the DREAM Act, that is where we got the name for Dreamers, which are people who would have qualified under that act. And so what happened was, because that act has never passed in Congress, in 2012, President Obama, by executive order, passed DACA, which stands for Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. And so when we think about deferred, meaning postponed action, essentially what it was a protection from deportation. It was a Band-Aid saying, we are not going to allow this population to be deported while we figure out how to create a permanent solution in Congress. And so through DACA, individuals that registered were able to get Social Security numbers, driver's license numbers, they were able to go to college, they were able to work. What they were not able to do was apply for any sort of permanent status. There was no pathway to permanent status as part of DACA. And they also did not qualify for federal financial aid and things like that for school. So again, DACA was really a Band-Aid that was meant to kind of postpone deportation until Congress could create a holistic solution. That was in 2012. And the requirements for that, so just so you know who qualified, you had to have been born in June of 1981 or later. You had to have arrived to the US before you were 16, and you had to have lived in the US since June of 2007. I know that's a lot of different years and numbers, but I point that out mostly to say that there were boundaries around this. And so there were people who may have come on June 17th, 1981, or who moved in, the fall of 2007 who wouldn't have qualified. So it didn't take care of everyone, but it was a narrow solution for a specific population. And a 800,000 people population who currently qualify or receive DACA in the US is about 800,000 people. So this executive order was passed in June 2012, and gosh, that was 7 years ago now, and still no legislative solution in Congress has passed in that time. And so what happened is that President Trump then canceled DACA by executive order as well. And so that is what is going to the Supreme Court now, is the question of, does the president have the authority to cancel DACA? So they will start hearing arguments tomorrow, which is why you'll see this come up in the news again over the next few weeks and months as we wait on a Supreme Court decision, which will likely be in the spring or early summer of 2020. And so in the meantime, you have 800,000 people, some of whom are almost 40. They're in their 30s and 40s at this point, or 20s and 30s, excuse me. I'm not in my 40s yet. But they're in those ages, so they're working, they're in school. There's been some discussion from the medical community because they have a lot of nurses and doctors who are working under DACA. And so I wanted to just give you that little bit of context so that as you hear those terms over the next few months, you understand what they're talking about. To cancel DACA without any permanent solution behind it is very, very damaging to 800,000 people and their daily lives. At the same time, I also want us to create a permanent solution so that this population doesn't have to continue to rely on a temporary fix that can be changed at any time. And I think that's been one of the most difficult things as a mom and as a Christian, listening to dreamers share their stories over the last few years, and some people that I've met with personally, is the immense stress that the unknown of the way that we have delayed this legislation impacts people. And so many people on both sides of the aisles will say that, DACA recipients didn't break any laws. They came with their parents. They shouldn't be held responsible for some of those decisions, that they should be allowed to work and live and build a life in the country they call home. And so I hope this helps as you hear those different terms over the next few months. And I encourage you to continue to call your legislators and say we need a permanent solution for dreamers, because regardless of what happens with DACA, we still need a permanent solution for dreamers. I encourage you, if you are someone who has the desire to write an op-ed or to speak at a church or whatever, to let other people know what's happening with dreamers. Again, it's funny, part of the reason I decided to do this video is I was talking to someone yesterday, and it was just interesting to see the confusion of, wait, DACA, dreamers, those sound a lot like the same thing, and who are those people? And I just thought we need to have some clarity around this so that we can speak about it, because it impacts real people. And continue to share stories of dreamers. You'll see us doing that both here in the Welcome group and on the Welcome page over the next few months as we wait on the Supreme Court decision, to just help us remember that there is a face behind legislation. Politics is about people, and we don't want to let kind of the current climate or the partisanship destroy something that could be really beautiful for people. And so I hope this is helpful. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the comments and I'll do my best to answer them. Have a great week.